Picture a half hour of television with no scandal, no competition, no ticking clock, and no host chasing a camera for attention. Just sawdust, quiet instruction, and a man in a plaid shirt turning rough lumber into a finished chair. That was the new Yankee Workshop, and for 21 years it worked. Then, in the fall of 2009, it simply stopped. No farewell tour. No dramatic finale. Just a short announcement from a Boston public broadcaster, and the workshop lights went dark for good. For a show that never made headlines while it was running, its ending made plenty. So what actually happened? Was it cancelled? Did ratings collapse? Was there a falling out behind the scenes? The real answer is quieter than any rumor, and in its own way, more honest. To understand the ending, you have to start with how the show came to exist at all. The new Yankee Workshop was the brainchild of producer Russell Morrish, the same man who created this old house. Morrish had spent years watching his lead carpenter, Norm Abram, work on renovation sites, and he saw something in Abram that was rare for television: total command of a craft, delivered without ego. According to Norm Abram's own biography, Abram had been swinging a hammer since childhood, learning from his father on job sites starting at around age 9, and had run his own general contracting company, Integrated Structures Incorporated, before Morrish ever put him on camera. He wasn't a television personality who'd picked up woodworking for a role. He was a working carpenter who happened to be good on camera. In 1988, Morrish decided to give Abram his own spin-off, separate from the renovation format of this old house. The stage for it already existed. A workshop Abram himself had built in Morrish's backyard back in 1979, a job that had first brought the two men together, according to Wikipedia's entry on Abram. Morrish had hired Abram to construct that small barn-style shop, and had been impressed enough by the young carpenter's efficiency and lack of wasted material that he brought him along to help renovate a run-down Victorian in Dorchester, the very project that became the pilot for this old house. Abram's transition from that one-off carpentry job to a permanent, on-camera role happened almost by accident, driven by competence rather than any ambition to be on television. That same backyard shop, expanded and outfitted to match the way Abram liked to work, became the set for the new series. The finished space measured 936 square feet, laid out with a table saw and assembly area at its center, a bank of stationary power tools along the walls, and a loft used for jig storage, a real, functioning shop rather than a set dressed up to look like one. The show premiered in 1989, with a pilot episode built around a reproduction of a 17th-century Massachusetts saltbox house design. The format never changed much over the years. Abram would introduce a piece, a Windsor chair, a blanket chest, sometimes a full outdoor structure like a gazebo or even a small sailboat, often visiting a historical example first, before returning to the shop to build the piece himself, on camera, largely without shortcuts. There was no elimination round, no guest celebrity, no manufactured conflict. It was simply a craftsman working through a project from rough stock to finished piece. That simplicity turned out to be the show's greatest asset. Over 21 seasons, Abram and the production team completed roughly 235 distinct projects, according to figures documented on Wikipedia's page for the series. Woodworking magazines tracked its influence for years. Readers wrote in describing how the show had pulled them into the hobby, and instructors reported new students showing up specifically because of what they'd seen on Saturday mornings. By any measure, the show had become one of the most quietly influential craft programs in American television history. What made the show credible was also what made it exhausting to produce. Reporting that followed the show's ending has consistently pointed to the same core fact. Each 22-minute episode represented somewhere between 40 and 60 hours of preparation, filming, and problem-solving. That included sourcing the right lumber, planning a build sequence that would actually translate to television, and, critically, Abram doing the actual woodworking himself, take after take, with no stand-in and no quiet substitution if a joint didn't fit the first time. This is where the new Yankee Workshop differed from a lot of what people assume about how television gets made. Abram wasn't demonstrating techniques he already knew would work off camera. He was building in real time, with the same risk of a bad cut or a warped board that any woodworker faces in their own shop. That authenticity is part of why the show earned so much trust from viewers who actually understood the craft. But it also meant the show could only move as fast and as carefully as one person's hands could work. And that person was carrying two jobs at once. During the years both series overlapped, Abram was still a regular presence on this old house, contributing as one carpenter among a rotating cast of tradespeople. On his own show, there was no rotation. He was the designer, the builder, and the host every single week for the entire run. By 2009, Norm Abram was approaching 60 years old, and he had spent roughly 2 decades standing and working in a shop built for craft, not comfort. None of the coverage from the time frames this as a single dramatic health event. There was no injury that ended the show overnight. Instead, what gets described, by Abram himself, by Moorish, and by outlets that covered the show's conclusion, is something more ordinary and, honestly, more relatable: the cumulative physical cost of decades of repetitive, physically demanding work. Standing for long hours during production seasons that regularly ran 40 to 60 hours a week, according to accounts published around the show's ending, is the kind of labor that wears on joints, backs, and feet over time regardless of how skilled or careful the person doing it is. It's worth being precise here about what is documented versus what is reasonable inference. Producer Russell Moorish, speaking to Woodworking magazine shortly after the announcement, put it plainly: Norm has done this for 20 years, and he thought it time to step back and do a little less. That is about as close to an official explanation as exists on record, and it lines up with the physical reality of the job. 2 decades of full-time, hands-on carpentry, performed on a concrete shop floor, is simply a lot to ask of any one body, even a highly skilled one. Nothing in the credible record suggests Abram suffered a specific injury or diagnosis that forced an abrupt stop. Rather, the picture that emerges is of a gradual accumulation of wear, the same kind any long-time tradesperson eventually has to reckon with, and a decision made proactively rather than in crisis. Here is the part that matters most, and the part that separates fact from the speculation that followed the announcement. When WGBH Boston confirmed on October 16, 2009, that no further episodes of the new Yankee Workshop would be produced, there was no controversy attached to the statement. A network spokesperson confirmed to Fine Home Building that Abram would continue appearing on this old house, which he did, for another 13 years. There was no mention of a contract dispute, no mention of falling ratings, and no mention of a rift between Abram and the production team. Moorish, in that same Woodworking magazine interview, was asked directly why Abram would step away from the new Yankee Workshop specifically, rather than his other show. His answer: "This old house is a much easier deal. Norm actually had to work on the new Yankee Workshop. It was a lot of work, and I certainly respect his decision to step back." Moorish also addressed the question fans kept asking: why not just find a replacement host and keep the format alive? He rejected the idea outright, telling the magazine that comparisons would be inevitable between Abram and anyone who took his place, and that the show had always been too tied to Abram personally to hand off to someone else. That's a meaningful detail, because it tells you the ending wasn't a business decision made around Abram, it was a decision made with him, treating the show as inseparable from the specific person who had built every piece on it for 2 decades. There was no search for a successor. There was no attempt to keep the brand running under new management. When Moorish said the show couldn't continue without Norm, he wasn't being sentimental. He meant it structurally. The format depended entirely on one working carpenter's hands, and when that carpenter decided to slow down, the format had nothing left to stand on. There's also a smaller, less discussed piece of the decision worth mentioning: opportunity cost. Every hour Abram spent prepping and filming a new episode was an hour he wasn't spending on his own house or his own projects. He had built his own timber-framed Colonial in Carlisle, Massachusetts, with help from his father years earlier, and by his own account there were details in that home he'd simply never gotten around to finishing because the production calendar always came first. Stepping back from the show wasn't just about relieving physical strain, it was also about reclaiming time that had been going, year after year, into someone else's shop and someone else's schedule rather than his own. It's also worth addressing the rumors directly, because there were some. In the years following the show's end, various explanations circulated online. some pointing to alleged health crises, others to speculative falling outs or network politics. Most of these lack any documented sourcing and should be treated with real skepticism. Several are built entirely on viewers noticing that Abram looked older or thinner in later years, which is an unremarkable thing to notice in a man who was approaching 60 after 20 years of physical labor on camera. The verifiable record, Morish's on-record comments, WGBH's own statement, and the continuity of Abram's role on this old house, doesn't support any of the more dramatic explanations. The mundane version is the accurate one. A skilled tradesman, getting older, chose to reduce his workload rather than push through indefinitely. Because the show hadn't shown any visible decline, no dip in quality, no signs of trouble, the announcement caught long-time viewers off guard, even though most people accept that long-running shows eventually end. Woodworking publications that covered the story described an unusually large and emotional response from readers, the kind normally reserved for much bigger cultural moments. That reaction wasn't really about losing a television program. It was about people recognizing what the show had quietly given them over 2 decades, a reason to pick up tools for the first time, a Saturday morning ritual shared with parents or kids, or simply a low-key, competent example of what patience and craft looked like when nobody was performing for the camera. What's notable is the near-total absence of anger in that response. People understood, even without a detailed explanation, that Abram had given the show everything he reasonably could. Nobody seemed to feel he owed the audience more. Reader comment sections on woodworking sites from that period read less like a television obituary and more like a string of thank you notes. Viewers described building their first real piece of furniture because they'd watched Abram do it first, or credited the show with helping them justify buying real tools instead of settling for whatever was cheapest at the hardware store. Some had been watching since the very first season and had kept every episode taped at home. Others simply wanted to acknowledge on the record that a television carpenter had taught them something they still used in their own lives 20 years later, which is an unusually durable kind of impact for a program that never once tried to be dramatic. The 235 projects built across the show's run haven't lost relevance. Shaker tables, Windsor chairs, blanket chests, and reproduction furniture styles don't go out of fashion the way trend-driven design does, because they were never chasing a trend to begin with. The show also sold measured drawings of its projects throughout its run, giving viewers a direct path from watching an episode to building the exact piece themselves. Plans that are, according to the show's official site maintained by Morish, still available today. The clearest evidence that the show's influence never really faded came in January 2023, when Morish announced that the entire back catalog of the new Yankee Workshop had been uploaded to YouTube for free. Wikipedia's page on the series quotes Morish's message on the announcement video, in which he expressed enthusiasm that a new generation who'd somehow missed out the first time could now discover the show. The response bore that out. Younger viewers who'd never seen the series on broadcast television found it online, and it found the same quiet audience it always had, just over a decade later. That timing wasn't accidental. It came shortly after Abram's own retirement from this old house in 2022, and the two moves together read like a deliberate final chapter: close out the active television career, then hand the archive to the public permanently and for free, so the 235 projects wouldn't simply sit unwatched in a network vault. It's a fairly rare thing for a television property to end on its creator's own terms and then, years later, be given back to its audience just as deliberately. Ending the new Yankee Workshop didn't mean Abram disappeared from television or from woodworking. He kept his role on this old house, where the workload was lighter and shared across a rotating team of tradespeople rather than resting entirely on him. He also had time, for the first time in years, to work on personal projects, including finishing details in the timber-framed Colonial home in Carlisle, Massachusetts, that he'd built himself with his father's help years earlier. In 2016, Abram appeared in Felled, a documentary about repurposing fallen urban trees into furniture, alongside woodworker and actor Nick Offerman, a project that fit naturally with how Abram had always talked about wood as a material with history, not just utility. Then, in 2022, after 43 years with this old house, Abram formally retired from that show as well. PBS marked the occasion with a 1-hour retrospective special, The House That Norm Built, which aired that October. True to form, there was no dramatic send-off, just a career-spanning acknowledgment of 4 decades of work, delivered the same way Abram had always delivered everything else, without unnecessary noise. Abram also continued writing during this period, adding to a body of published work that already included several books on woodworking and home construction written during and after his time on both shows. That writing carried the same tone the show always had, direct, practical, and focused on helping someone else get the job done correctly, rather than on building up his own profile. It's a small thing, but it fits the larger pattern. Even once the cameras were gone, the instinct to teach clearly and without pretense never really left him. So what actually ended the new Yankee Workshop? Not a scandal. Not falling ratings. Not a contract dispute. The most credible on-record explanation, coming directly from the show's own producer, is straightforward. A man in his late 50s, after 20 years of genuinely doing every bit of the physical work himself, decided it was time to slow down, and the people around him respected that decision enough not to replace him. That's not the kind of story that makes headlines. But it's consistent with everything the show itself was built on, a total lack of pretense, and a willingness to let the work speak for itself, right up until the day the work stopped. A Russell Morrish interview, Woodworking magazine, republished by NJN Network, October 2009. Fine Home Building, saying goodbye to Norm Abram and his new Yankee Workshop, 2009. Wikipedia, the new Yankee Workshop, and Norm Abram, Access 2026. IMDb/Film Freeway, Feld, a documentary film about giving new life to fallen urban trees, 2016.